Every parent's worst nightmare was about to become a reality on the dusty main street of Dry Creek, Wyoming. A mother was about to lose her child, not to death or disease, but to men who saw a little girl as nothing more than payment for a debt. It was 1882, and Sariah Harwell held her 8-year-old daughter tight as 3 debt collectors surrounded them. Her husband had died in debt, and these men wanted the child as collateral. The entire town watched from their doorways, but no one moved to help. Sariah begged and pleaded, but the men only smiled coldly. Then, a giant of a man stepped out from the shadows. Jeremiah Cole was scarred by war and hadn't spoken a word in 20 years. He was known as the Silent Mountain Man, a recluse who lived in isolation. But when he saw what was happening to this mother and her child, something inside him stirred. He walked slowly toward the collectors, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the street. What could possibly drive a broken man to risk everything for strangers he had never met? Before we go back, tell us where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow I have something very special in store for you. The morning began like any other for Sariah Harwell, with the cruel certainty that this could be her last day on the land her husband had died trying to protect. She stood at the cracked window of her one-room cabin, watching the sun paint the Wyoming mountains in shades of gold and amber, while her 8-year-old daughter, Katie, slept peacefully on the narrow cot they shared. The simple gold wedding band that had graced Sariah's finger for 10 years now lay wrapped in a handkerchief on the wooden table. Her last valuable possession, pawned yesterday to buy 3 more days from the collectors. Benjamin Harwell's topographical map still hung on the cabin's only interior wall, its edges yellowed and corners frayed from being examined so many times. The careful lines and notations meant nothing to Sariah beyond marking the boundaries of their 160-acre homestead. But Benjamin had spent countless nights studying those papers with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She had asked him once what held his attention, and he had simply smiled and said the land had more potential than either of them knew. Now, 18 months after his death, in what the town doctor called a tragic riding accident, those enigmatic words felt like whispers from beyond the grave. The cabin itself told the story of their struggle in every weathered board and patch. Benjamin had built it with his own hands in the summer of 1878, when they first laid claim to this remote corner of the territory. The walls still bore the marks of his careful work. Each log fit with the precision of a man who knew the Wyoming winter showed no mercy to shoddy construction. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney drawing smoke efficiently even in the worst of storms. Shelves lined another wall, now mostly bare except for a few tins of beans and a sack of flour that would last perhaps another week if Sariah rationed it carefully. Kate stirred on the cot, her small face peaceful in sleep, despite the uncertainty that clouded her days. She had her father's auburn hair and gentle disposition, but her mother's steel-gray eyes, which seemed to hold a wisdom beyond her years. The child had accepted their dire circumstances with a grace that both amazed and broke Sariah's heart. When other children in town whispered about the poor widow and her daughter, Katie would simply lift her chin and declare that her mother was the strongest person in the whole Wyoming territory. 5 miles up the winding mountain trail from Dry Creek, another soul began his daily ritual of survival and solitude. Jeremiah Cole's cabin clung to a rocky outcrop like an eagle's nest, overlooking the entire valley below. Built from massive pine logs and chinked with mountain clay, the structure looked as if it had grown from the mountainside itself. Inside, the space was Spartan, but meticulously kept. A single room served as his living quarters, with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and chair, and a narrow bed covered with woolen blankets and a bearskin. He had taken his first winter in the mountains. The war had ended 17 years ago, but for Jeremiah, the battles continued every morning. When he awoke into a silence so complete, it felt like water pressing on his eardrums. A Confederate mini-ball, lodged near his vocal cords, was a souvenir from Gettysburg that army surgeons had declared too dangerous to remove. It had stolen his voice and, in many ways, his connection to the world of men. He had tried to return to civilian life after the war, but the stares and awkward conversations drove him further into isolation, until he finally surrendered to the mountains that asked nothing of him but survival. His daily routine varied little. Before dawn, he would check the traps that provided much of his meat, tend to his small garden, and repair whatever the previous day's weather had damaged. Twice a month, he made the trip down to Dry Creek for supplies, moving through town like a ghost, conducting his business with gestures and written notes when absolutely necessary. The townspeople had long since given up trying to engage him in conversation, though the children still pointed and whispered about the giant man with the terrible scar who lived alone in the mountains. Dr. Whitfield, who ran the general store and served as the town's unofficial physician, was one of the few people who showed Jeremiah any kindness. The old man had served as a field surgeon during the war and recognized the particular kind of damage done by seeing too much death too young. He never pressed Jeremiah to speak. He simply nodded in acknowledgement when the mountain man appeared for supplies and accepted his payment without comment. In the territorial bank that dominated Dry Creek's main street, the banker, Harrison Croft, reviewed the Harwell file with the satisfaction of a man about to close a profitable transaction. The ornate building stood in stark contrast to the rustic log structures that made up most of the town, its imported bricks and glass windows announcing the growing influence of Eastern capital in the Western Territories. Croft's office took up the entire second floor, furnished with a mahogany desk and leather chairs that broadcasted wealth and power. The Harwell debt had ballooned from Benjamin's original $800 loan to nearly $3,000, thanks to the accumulated interest and fees Croft had applied with creative enthusiasm. The collateral agreement, signed in desperation during Benjamin's final illness, gave the bank the right to claim any and all assets in the event of default, including the guardianship of minor children until the debt could be worked off. Such arrangements were not uncommon in the territories, where the law was often whatever the most powerful men decided it should be. The territorial judge, Harrison Blackstone, who was due to arrive the following week to formalize the proceedings, had never once ruled against the banking consortium that provided his most generous campaign contributions. The system worked well for those with enough money to make it work for them. Sheriff Morton Webb sat in the saloon, nursing his third whiskey of the morning, contemplating the unpleasant task that awaited him. A large, paunchy man, Webb had worn the badge for 6 years without ever having to draw his gun in anger. His authority stemmed from the bank's backing, not from any particular courage or sense of justice. The arrangement suited him just fine. He kept order among the drunks and vagrants, leaving serious matters to men with better schooling and deeper pockets. The Harwell debt collection would be his most distasteful duty yet, but Croft had made it clear that cooperation was not optional. Webb's own gambling debts to certain unsavory characters in Cheyenne left him little room for moral scruples. He would do what needed to be done and try not to think too much about the consequences for a woman and child who had never done him any harm. As the sun climbed higher over Dry Creek, casting sharp shadows between the buildings that lined the dusty main street, The various threads of fate began to intertwine. Sariah prepared Katie's breakfast with the last of their eggs, trying not to let the worry show on her face. Katie chattered about the adventures she planned for the day, unaware that men were already gathering to tear her world apart. In his mountain cabin, Jeremiah finished his morning chores and prepared for his bi-monthly trip into town for groceries. He strapped his Colt revolver to his belt, more out of habit than any expectation of trouble, and saddled the sturdy mountain pony that had been his only companion for 5 years. The animal, a tough little Mustang named Scout, seemed to sense its owner's mood and stood quietly as Jeremiah attached the saddlebags and checked the placement of his rifle in its scabbard. The town of Dry Creek stretched along both sides of the creek that gave it its name, a collection of false front buildings and rustic cabins that housed nearly 300 souls. Main Street ran east to west, crossed by 2 side streets that petered out into dirt tracks leading to outlying homesteads. The north side held the bank, the general store, the saloon, and the hotel, the commercial heart of the community. The south side housed the sheriff's office, the church, the schoolhouse, and a collection of private homes that ranged from modest cabins to Croft's impressive 2-story mansion. Most residents were decent people trying to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. Farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen who had come west seeking opportunity and found mostly hard work and uncertainty. They formed a community bound by shared hardship and mutual dependence, though that solidarity had its limits when powerful interests made their displeasure known. Agnes Payne, the young schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston the previous fall, represented the growing influence of Eastern education and progressive ideas in the territory. A woman of 26 with intelligent brown eyes and prematurely graying hair, she had quickly established herself as a voice for compassion and justice in community affairs. Her small schoolhouse also served as a meeting place for the more democratically minded citizens, who sometimes questioned the bank's growing influence in local politics. As the morning wore on toward the fateful confrontation that would change everything, each character in the drama moved through patterns established by months or years of routine. None could predict how thoroughly those patterns would be shattered by the choices made in the next few hours, or how the silence of one scarred man would prove more powerful than all their words combined. The stage was set for a collision between justice and greed, between the powerful and the vulnerable, between a world that valued only profit and those who still believed some things, family, honor, protecting the innocent, were more important than money. In a few short hours, Sariah Harwell would face the worst moment of her life, and the man who hadn't spoken in 20 years would find his voice in the most unexpected way. The 3 men arrived at Sariah's cabin at precisely noon. Their polished boots and tailored suits announced their authority before they ever spoke a word. Harrison Croft led the delegation, his gold pocket watch glinting in the harsh Wyoming sun as he consulted it with theatrical precision. Behind him stood 2 enforcers on loan from the territorial sheriff's office. Hard, cold-eyed men who made their living collecting debts others found too distasteful to pursue. "Mrs. Harwell," Croft called out, his voice carrying the false politeness of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I trust you received our final notification regarding your late husband's obligations to the First Territorial Bank." Sariah stepped out of the cabin with Katie at her side, the child's small hand clutching her mother's worn skirt. The sight of the official party sent a chill through her blood, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "Mr. Croft, I have told you repeatedly, I need more time. The harvest—" "The harvest?" Croft's laugh was without warmth. My dear woman, 3 acres of struggling corn will hardly satisfy a debt of $3,000, plus accrued interest and fees. He pulled a leather satchel from his coat and produced several official-looking documents. I'm afraid the time for negotiations has passed. Sheriff Webb appeared from around the corner of the cabin, having approached on foot while the main party drew her attention. His presence sealed off any hope of escape, though where could a woman and child run in this vast wilderness anyway? He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that might have been respectful under different circumstances. Sheriff, Sariah said, feeling the tremor in her own voice. Surely there must be some legal recourse. Ma'am, Webb cut in, his discomfort obvious in the way he avoided her gaze. The law is quite clear on matters of debt collection. Mr. Croft has all the necessary documentation. Katie drew closer to her mother, sensing the tension without fully understanding its implications. At 8 years old, all she knew was that these men frightened her mother, and that was enough to kindle a defensive flame in her young heart. "Leave my mother alone," she declared with all the authority her small voice could muster. One of the collectors, a thin man with a face pockmarked by smallpox and yellowed teeth, laughed at the child's defiance. "This one's got spirit. Ought to fetch a good price working the eastern textile mills. Plenty of families need household help they can train up right." The casual cruelty of his words struck Sariah like a physical blow. The reality of these men's intentions hit her with devastating clarity. They weren't just taking her land. They meant to take Katie, to sell her into what amounted to legal slavery in some distant factory or home where Sariah would never see her again. "No," she whispered. Then louder, as desperation lent her strength. "No, you can't take my daughter. I'll sign whatever papers you want. I'll give you the land. I'll give you everything. But you cannot take my child." Croft's expression remained unchanged, as if he were discussing the weather rather than the destruction of a family. "I'm afraid that's not how contracts work, Mrs. Harwell. The collateral agreement your husband signed specifically includes all family members as potential assets. Given the scope of the debt, we will require both the land and the child's labor contract to approach anything resembling fair compensation." The townspeople had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion and the sight of official vehicles in front of the Harwell cabin. They clustered at a safe distance, close enough to see but far enough to avoid involvement. Sariah recognized faces in the crowd. Neighbors who had shared meals with her family, church members who had offered condolences at Benjamin's funeral, shopkeepers who had extended credit when times were lean. Yet not one of them stepped forward to challenge what was happening. Dr. Whitfield stood near the porch of his general store, his weathered face a mask of concern and shame. Ignis Pine had come out from the schoolhouse, his hands clenched into fists as he watched the proceedings with clear anguish. Even old Cyrus Beck, whose farm bordered the Harwell property, had come to watch the spectacle. But watching was all they dared to do. "Please," Sariah's voice broke as she fell to her knees in the dirt, still clutching Katie's hand. "I'm begging you. Take everything else, but don't take my daughter. She's all I have left in this world." The pockmarked enforcer seized Katie's other arm. "Come on, girl. Fighting won't make it any easier." It was then that Katie screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror that echoed through the mountains and seemed to hang in the still air, an indictment of every adult who stood by and did nothing. The sound cut through the crowd's murmured conversations and the uncomfortable shuffling of feet, demanding acknowledgement of the cruelty being perpetrated in broad daylight. Jeremiah Cole heard that scream 3 blocks away as he was guiding Scout down Main Street toward the general store. 20 years of mountain solitude had honed his hearing to an almost preternatural keenness, and something in that child's cry touched a depth in his soul he had thought permanently frozen. He reached for his neck unconsciously, his fingers tracing the scar where the Confederate bullet had stolen his voice, and with it, he'd believed, his capacity to care for anyone's suffering but his own. The Confederate mini-ball had done more than damage his vocal cords. It had lodged near major blood vessels, and the Army surgeons had declared it too dangerous to remove, a permanent reminder of the moment at Gettysburg when his world had exploded in smoke, screams, and blood. For months after, he had carried the bullet's weight like a stone in his throat, unable to speak above a whisper, unable to bear the sound of his own damaged voice trying to form words. But Katie's scream pierced 2 decades of self-imposed isolation, like a bugle call to battle. Jeremiah's hands tightened on Scout's reins as the muscle memory of his days as Captain Cole of the 5th Pennsylvania Infantry flooded back. He had been a different man then. A leader of men. A strategist whose unit had never lost a battle. A soldier who had earned his rank through merit, not politics or family connections. Scout felt his rider's sudden tension and sidestepped, ears pricked forward in alarm. Jeremiah guided the horse through the crowd with a gentle pressure of his knees, his clear blue eyes taking in the scene with the swift appraisal that had kept him off through 4 years of war. 3 armed men, 1 woman, 1 child. Poor odds. But he had faced worse. As he drew closer, he could see the tear tracks on Sariah's dirt-smudged cheeks, the way Katie trembled as she tried to be brave for her mother. The sight stirred memories he'd spent 20 years trying to bury, of other women, other children, caught in the machinery of powerful men's ambitions. The war had been full of such scenes, and his inability to save them all had been part of what drove him into the mountains when peace finally came. The crowd parted as Scout approached, recognizing Jeremiah's imposing figure, even if they had never heard him speak. At 6'4" of weathered muscle and bone, clad in buckskin and homespun, he looked like an elemental force of the mountains themselves. The scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw caught the sunlight, a pale line that spoke of violence survived and pain endured. Croft looked up from his papers with faint irritation. "Mr. Cole, is it? I don't believe this matter concerns you." Jeremiah dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled. He had learned long ago that silence could be more intimidating than shouting, and his physical presence alone had ended more than one potential confrontation during his rare trips to town. He walked to where Sariah knelt in the dirt and held out a hand to help her up. She looked at him with a mixture of hope and confusion. This mountain stranger, who had never so much as spoken a word to her, was now offering aid while her own neighbors stood in cowardly silence. His pale eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his formidable appearance, and she took his hand, rising to her feet as Katie pressed against her side. The pockmarked henchman released Katie's arm and took a step back, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun on his hip. "Mister, you'd best move along. This is official business." Jeremiah said nothing, but positioned himself between the men and the mother and child, his intent made clear by posture and proximity alone. His own Colt remained holstered, but his stance suggested a familiarity with violence and a readiness to employ it if necessary. For a long moment, the tableau held, predators and protector, sizing each other up as the crowd held a collective breath. Then Croft cleared his throat, attempting to reassert control. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate your concern for Mrs. Harwell's situation, but the law is quite clear on matters of debt collection. You may wish to review the relevant statutes before involving yourself in affairs beyond your comprehension. Jeremiah's only response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the banker. Though he made no threatening gesture, something in his bearing suggested that Croft's words carried less weight than the banker might hope. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until Sheriff Webb finally spoke, his voice strained with nervousness. "Maybe we should come back later, Mr. Croft. Give folks time to think things over." "An excellent suggestion, Sheriff," Croft agreed, though his tone implied the postponement was tactical, not merciful. "Mrs. Harwell has until morning to arrange for an orderly transfer of the assets. I trust she will use that time wisely." As the three men retreated, Jeremiah remained motionless until their buggy had disappeared around the bend toward town. Only then did he turn to Sariah, who was staring at him with equal parts gratitude and bewilderment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from weeping. "I don't know why you helped us, but thank you." Jeremiah gave a single nod and touched the brim of his hat before turning back to scout. As he rode away, he felt the weight of the crowd's stares and heard the murmur of conversations his intervention had sparked. But for the first time in 20 years, he felt something stir in his chest that might have been hope, or perhaps just the echo of the man he had been before the war had taken everything away. The evening shadows stretched long across the valley as Sariah finally worked up the courage to climb the mountain trail to Jeremiah's cabin. Katie walked beside her, clutching the corn-husk doll her father had made for her during his last winter. It was a simple toy, made of dried husks and scraps of cloth, but it was priceless, one of the few tangible links to Benjamin's memory. The child had insisted on coming, declaring she wanted to thank the man who saved them. Sariah suspected her daughter's courage might succeed where her own nervousness would fail. The cabin appeared suddenly around a bend in the trail, its solid construction and impeccable upkeep a testament to its occupant's character. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the light from a lamp glowed warmly through the single window. Sariah hesitated at the edge of the clearing, suddenly unsure about intruding on a man who clearly valued his solitude. Katie had no such reservations. She marched up to the heavy plank door and knocked with the confidence of a child who had never learned to fear rejection. "Mr. Cole, it's Katie Harwell. Mama and I came to say thank you." The door swung open, revealing Jeremiah's towering frame, though his expression softened as he looked down at the little girl gazing up at him, without a trace of the fear most people showed. He gave a solemn nod and stepped aside, gesturing them in with the same formal courtesy he might have shown visiting generals during his army days. The cabin's interior surprised Sariah with its neatness and simple comfort. Everything had its place. Cooking utensils hung in orderly rows from wooden pegs. Books lined a shelf near the hearth, and a military precision was evident in the arrangement of furniture and supplies. A small desk sat beneath the window, equipped with paper, ink, and pens that suggested regular use despite his inability to speak. Jeremiah motioned to 2 chairs near the fire and busied himself preparing coffee with practiced efficiency. Katie settled into the larger chair with an unself-conscious ease, swinging her legs and taking in her surroundings with bright curiosity. "This is a nice house," she announced. "Did you build it all by yourself?" He nodded, then walked to the desk and returned with a slip of paper on which he had written, "5 summers to finish. Started with just the foundation." "That's a long time," Katie observed seriously. "But it's very sturdy. Mama says strong things last longer." She held up her cornhusk doll. "Papa made this for me before he went to heaven." Mama says I have to take good care of it because it's all I have left of him. Something flickered across Jeremiah's scarred face at the mention of loss and memory. He knelt beside Katie's chair, his large frame somehow managing not to seem threatening as he examined the doll with gentle attention. The child's easy acceptance of his marked appearance and silent communication seemed to unlock something in him that had been shut for decades. Sariah watched the interaction with growing amazement. Katie had always been friendly with adults, but there was something special in the way she responded to Jeremiah, as if she recognized a kindred spirit despite the obvious differences in their circumstances. She doesn't usually take to strangers so quickly, Sariah said softly. Jeremiah returned to his desk and wrote, "Children see more clearly than adults. No pretense." The simple wisdom of his observation struck Sariah with unexpected force. In her world of constant worry about appearances, debts, and social standing, she had almost forgotten what genuine simplicity felt like. "I wanted to thank you for what you did today," she told him. "I don't know why you helped us." But he was already writing again, his pen moving with surprising speed across the paper. Wrong is wrong. Some things don't need explaining. Katie giggled as she watched him write. "Why don't you talk with your mouth instead of writing everything down?" Sariah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Katie, that's not polite to ask." But Jeremiah was already reaching for the pen again, seemingly unbothered by the child's directness. "Hurt my throat in the war." "Does it still hurt?" Kate asked, with the guileless concern children reserve for physical ailments. He touched his throat for a moment, then shook his head. Kate accepted this with the easy pliancy of youth and turned her attention to the books on his shelf. "Can you read all of these?" Another nod, followed by a note scribbled on his slate. "Books are good companions. They never argue, nor do they ask for anything in return." The rich aroma of coffee filled the small space as Jeremiah poured the dark liquid into tin cups that matched everything else in the cabin. Functional, well-maintained, and utterly without pretense. Despite the strangeness of her circumstances, Sariah felt herself begin to relax. There was a profound peace to this place, a quiet stillness that soothed a part of her that had been coiled tight for months. "Mr. Cole," she began cautiously, "the men who came today, they'll be back tomorrow. They'll have more papers and likely more men to enforce them. I am grateful for what you did, but I cannot let you bring trouble upon yourself for our sake." Jeremiah's expression hardened as he wrote. "Croft has been acquiring land throughout the territory. He uses legal trickery to dispossess families who lack the means to fight back." The revelation sent a chill down Sariah's spine. She had believed their plight was unique, a bitter consequence of her late husband Benjamin's poor judgment. "You mean, we aren't the first?" "You're the third family this year. The others had no one to stand with them." The implications landed on Sariah with the force of a physical blow. If this was part of a larger pattern, then appealing to Croft's better nature was a fool's errand. There was no better nature to appeal to. What happened to the other families? His slate was grim. The Jansons moved back east, lost everything. Widow Carmichael now works as a servant in Croft's own house. Her daughter was sent off to work in Denver. Kate looked up from a book she was examining. "What does that mean, Mama?" Sariah struggled for words to explain the cruelty of men in a way a child could grasp without being terrified. "It means that some people take things that don't belong to them, sweetie." "That's stealing," Kate said with certainty. "Papa always said stealing was wrong." Jeremiah nodded his approval, writing, "Your papa was right. But sometimes the thieves wear fine suits and use grand words to make their theft seem like law." Their conversation was cut short by the sound of approaching horses. In an instant, Jeremiah extinguished the lamp and moved to the window. His entire demeanor shifted, the quiet homesteader replaced by a man coiled with weary alertness. Through the gathering twilight, they could make out three riders, Sheriff Webb and the same two deputies from the afternoon. "Mrs. Harwell," Webb's voice cut through the evening air. "We know you're in there. Come on out, and we can discuss this like civilized folk." Jeremiah was already in motion, gathering items from around the cabin with a practiced, military efficiency. He handed Sariah a slip of paper. "Back door leads to a root cellar. Wait there until they're gone." "I won't hide while you face them alone," she whispered fiercely. He was already writing again, his movements quick and decisive. "I'm not facing them. I'm leading them away. Take Kate. Hide." Before she could protest further, he crossed to the far wall and opened a hidden door she hadn't noticed. The space beyond was a small, well-stocked hiding place, complete with blankets and water. Sensing the gravity of the moment, Kate followed her mother without a word. From the darkness, they heard Webb's voice grow more insistent, followed by the splintering crack of the front door being forced open. They heard Jeremiah's heavy boots cross the floorboards above, then the sound of him stepping outside. Muffled male voices exchanged words they couldn't decipher, followed by the sound of horses riding away. They waited in the suffocating dark for what felt like hours before the cellar door creaked open, revealing Jeremiah's familiar silhouette. His written message was brief. "Gone for now. They'll be back. We need a plan." When they returned to the warmth of the main room, Sariah realized that accepting this man's help meant stepping into a world she didn't understand. A world where good people hid from those sworn to uphold the law. But looking at Kate's trusting face, bathed in the soft glow of the relit lamp, she knew she had no choice. She had to trust this silent guardian who had already risked everything for them. The decision was made for them at dawn, announced by a thin column of smoke rising against the pale morning sky in the direction of their homestead. Jeremiah had ridden out to scout before sunrise and returned with grim news. "Cabins burned. They're telling folks you fled in the night, abandoned the property." Sariah stared at the distant smoke, a numb disbelief washing over her. The small home where she had spent 4 years building a life with Benjamin, where Kate had taken her first steps, was gone. With it vanished the last tangible link to the dreams they had once shared. "Why would they burn it?" she asked, her voice hollow, though she already knew the answer. Jeremiah's written reply confirmed her fears. "It's easier to claim abandonment when there's nothing left. It also sends a message." Kate, with the resilience of a child who cannot grasp the magnitude of the disaster, simply asked, "Are we going to live in the mountains now?" As if it were a grand adventure. "For a while, sweetie," Sariah said, forcing the despair from her voice. "Just until we figure out what to do next." The mountain cabin felt different now, a permanent refuge rather than a temporary shelter. Jeremiah cleared space for their few belongings with methodical precision. A delicate negotiation determined the sleeping arrangements. Kate would share the bed with her mother, while Jeremiah insisted he preferred the floor by the hearth, wrapped in his military-issue blankets. As they settled into a routine, Sariah observed her silent host with growing curiosity. The cabin's Spartan organization spoke of military discipline, but personal touches hinted at a hidden depth. A bookshelf held poetry alongside military histories. Sketches of landscapes and wildlife, rendered with surprising skill, were tucked between the pages of books. Most intriguing was a small wooden box beneath his writing desk, which seemed to contain a bundle of letters. Kate, however, had no such reservations. She discovered the sketches within hours. "Did you draw this mountain?" she asked, holding up a detailed rendering of the peak visible from their window. He nodded, writing, "Drew it last winter. The snow makes everything look different." "Can you teach me?" The request seemed to startle him, but after a moment, he nodded again. He produced paper and a charcoal pencil, sitting beside her at the table with the quiet patience of a man with nowhere else to be. Watching them, Sariah felt a complex swell of gratitude, guilt for intruding on his solitude, and a deep uncertainty about their future. "She needs schooling," Sariah said quietly later, as Kate slept, "and the company of other children." Jeremiah considered this, then wrote, "Agnes Pine comes up the mountain sometimes, brings books, teaches anyone who wants to learn." The news surprised her. She had seen the school teacher in town, but never imagined she made such journeys. "Why does she come all this way?" "Grew up on the frontier," he wrote. "Understands learning doesn't only happen in a schoolhouse." The conversation was interrupted by Kate's excited voice. "Mama, look! A secret drawer!" She had been exploring the desk and had found a hidden compartment. Before either adult could stop her, she pulled out a bundle of official-looking papers tied with a faded military ribbon. Jeremiah moved faster than Sariah had ever seen, crossing the room in 2 long strides and gently, but firmly, taking the papers from Kate's hands. His face was pale, his expression one of profound disturbance. "I'm sorry," Kate said, immediately sensing she had crossed a line. Jeremiah was already kneeling beside her, his expression softening as he scribbled a note. "Not your fault. Some things are just private." Sariah's curiosity burned, but she respected his silent plea for privacy. "Kate, what did we talk about respecting people's things?" "Not to touch unless they say it's okay," Kate recited dutifully. Jeremiah seemed to wrestle with himself for a long moment. Then, with a deep breath, he made a decision that clearly cost him something. He untied the ribbon and withdrew a single document from the stack. He handed it to Sariah. It was his military discharge. The formal language and official seal identified him as Captain Jeremiah Cole, 5th Pennsylvania Infantry, with commendations for distinguished service at Antietam, Fredericksburg, and Gettysburg. Sariah read it with growing astonishment. The silent hermit of the mountain was a decorated war hero, an officer who had led men through some of the bloodiest battles ever fought on American soil. The papers told a story of courage and leadership that was utterly at odds with his solitary existence. "You were a captain," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "Different life. Different man." "Same man," she corrected gently. "Just one who has carried a heavy burden, alone." Kate studied the document with a serious frown. "Were you very brave in the war?" Jeremiah took longer than usual to write his reply. "I tried to keep my men alive. Sometimes I did. Sometimes I didn't. The ones who didn't come home. They were the brave ones." The simple honesty of his words revealed more about his character than any official commendation ever could. Sariah began to understand. His isolation wasn't just about a physical injury. It was the crushing weight of responsibility and loss. As evening fell, they settled into a domestic routine that felt surprisingly natural. After dinner, Kate convinced Jeremiah to continue her drawing lesson by lamplight, her small fingers proving adept under his patient guidance. Watching them, Sariah felt something she hadn't experienced since Benjamin's death, a sense of family warmth, born not of blood, but of mutual care and respect. "We can't stay here forever," she said quietly, once Kate had fallen asleep. Jeremiah nodded, his pencil scratching on the slate. "But we can stay long enough to make a plan. Croft won't give up easily. But he isn't the only one with resources." The implicit promise in his words gave Sariah the first real glimmer of hope she had felt in months. Perhaps they weren't alone in this fight after all. 3 days into their mountain exile, Jeremiah made a decision that surprised even himself. He saddled his horse, Scout, before dawn, and rode the treacherous trails toward a settlement 20 miles northeast of Dry Creek. There, a man named Murphy O'Brien ran a small cattle operation with his wife and grown sons. The two men hadn't spoken since the war ended, but some bonds, forged in the crucible of battle, never truly break. O'Brien's homestead lay in a protected valley, a picture of prosperity earned through hard work. Jeremiah approached openly, knowing his former sergeant would have spotted him long before he reached the gate. True to form, Murphy emerged from the barn before Jeremiah had even dismounted, his time-weathered face breaking into the first genuine smile the mountain man had seen in years. "Well, damn me," Murphy said, his Irish brogue still thick after 30 years in the States. "Captain Jeremiah Cole. I'd heard you'd taken a vow of silence like some kind of monk." Jeremiah gave a curt nod, pulling a small notebook and pencil from his saddlebag. His hand moved quickly across the page. "I need your help, Murphy. The situation in Dry Creek involves corruption. A child is in danger." The big Irishman's jovial expression evaporated as he read the note. The lines around his eyes hardened. "Get inside, Captain," he said, his voice low. "It sounds like we need a proper talk." Inside the comfortable farmhouse, Murphy's wife, Ellen, quietly saw to their unexpected guest, while Murphy retrieved a bottle of Irish whiskey, one he'd been aging since before the war. For Jeremiah, the familiar ritual, military men gathering to discuss serious matters, felt both alien and natural after so many years of self-imposed isolation. "All right then," Murphy said, settling into his chair with the whiskey between them. "Tell me about this corruption, and don't you spare a single detail." Jeremiah's written account took nearly an hour to complete. A silent, damning narrative that covered everything from the suspicious death of Benjamin Harwell to the systematic seizure of land by the banking consortium. Murphy read each page with focused intensity, his occasional questions sharp and insightful, betraying a keen intellect undulled by his quiet, rural retirement. "Harrison Croft," Murphy mused when the account was finished. "I've heard the name. Word is he's backed by Eastern investors. They want the mineral rights across this whole territory, and they aren't particular about how they get them." The confirmation of his suspicions brought Jeremiah a cold mix of relief and dread. His fears were real, which meant he was facing more than simple local greed. But it also meant the reach of his opposition was far greater than one small-town banker. "The question is," Murphy continued, leaning forward, "what do you intend to do about it? Because if you're planning on taking on a territorial conspiracy, you'll need more than righteous anger and your mountain survival skills." Jeremiah wrote, "Gather proof, find out who else is involved, protect Sarah and Katie, build a case for the federal authorities." Murphy nodded in approval. "A sound strategy, Captain. But you'll need allies who understand these political games, and you'll need to accept that some battles can't be won with silence and isolation. That afternoon, Jeremiah rode back to his mountain cabin with a renewed sense of purpose, only to be met with devastating news. While he had been speaking with Murphy, Sarah had made a discovery that changed everything they thought they knew. She was waiting for him in the main room of the cabin, Benjamin's old leather-bound journal open on the table before her. Katie sat beside it, absorbed in a drawing, her skill showing remarkable improvement under Jeremiah's patient instruction. He was immediately struck by the contrast, the child's innocent focus and the mother's look of shocked revelation. "I found this," Sarah said, her voice tight. Hidden behind a loose floorboard near the hearth. Benjamin knew. He knew about the silver deposits on our land. He knew exactly what Croft was after. Jeremiah read the journal entries with a growing sense of astonishment. Benjamin Harwell, it turned out, knew far more about geology and mining than anyone had imagined. His careful research had identified a significant silver lode running directly through their property and extending into the surrounding hills. More importantly, his final entries revealed he had refused several offers to sell the mineral rights, despite mounting pressure from bank representatives. The last entry, dated just 2 days before his death, was particularly chilling. "Croft made a final offer today. When I refused again, he said, 'Some men are too stubborn for their own good.' Something in his eyes made me fear for Sarah and Katie's safety. If anything happens to me, I've hidden the survey maps and mineral samples where only she would think to look. If I'm right about the silver veins, our small homestead is sitting on a fortune worth more than anything Croft could ever steal through legal tricks." "It wasn't an accident," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "They killed him because he wouldn't sell." Jeremiah's face was grim as he nodded and wrote on his pad. "Murder disguised as an accident. Common practice when legal methods fail." Katie looked up from her drawing, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. "Why are you two sad? Did something bad happen?" Sarah struggled for words that would acknowledge the child's perception without overwhelming her. "We found something important about Papa, sweetheart. Something that explains why those men want our land so badly." "Because Papa found a treasure?" Katie asked, with the simple acceptance children have for the mysteries of the world. "Something like that," Sarah confirmed, once again amazed by her daughter's intuition. The implications of Benjamin's journal transformed their situation from a matter of debt collection into one of conspiracy and murder. With documented proof of the silver and Benjamin's recorded suspicions about Croft's methods, they now had the foundation for a real legal challenge. But they also had proof that their opponents were willing to kill to achieve their goals. "We need help," Sarah said. "Real help, from people who know how to fight this kind of corruption." Jeremiah was already writing. "Murphy O'Brien is trustworthy. He knows people in the territorial government who aren't bought by Eastern money. He also mentioned the school teacher, Agnes Pine, might be a more useful ally than we imagined." This last point intrigued Sarah. She'd seen Agnes in town, but they had never spoken at length. "What makes you think she can help?" "Murphy says she corresponds regularly with territorial officials about education funding. She has connections in the federal government through teachers' associations, and she grew up in mining country. She understands mineral rights." The idea of approaching Agnes Pine felt like the first proactive step they could take in their own defense. Unlike the townspeople who had stood by in silence as Croft's men threatened Katie, the school teacher had shown visible distress at the proceedings. Perhaps she would be willing to actively oppose the banking consortium's methods. "There's one more thing," Sarah said, her voice dropping lower. "The journal mentions hidden mineral samples. If Benjamin was right about the silver veins, we could have physical proof of our land's true value." Jeremiah considered this, then wrote, "That proof could win your case, or it could get you killed faster. It all depends on who we trust with the information." The weight of that choice hung over them like the mountain fog, thick, obscuring, and impossible to ignore. They now possessed the knowledge and the evidence to fight Croft's conspiracy, but using it would require trusting people they barely knew and revealing secrets that had already cost one man his life. As night fell, they sat in contemplative silence while Katie continued her drawing, blissfully unaware that her father's hidden journal had just turned their desperate flight into something resembling a counterattack. For the first time since Benjamin's death, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. They might finally have weapons to match their enemies' legal and financial advantages. But weapons were only as good as the courage and skill of those who wielded them. She wasn't at all certain either of them was prepared for the kind of war Benjamin's discovery had just made inevitable. Agnes Pine arrived at Jeremiah's cabin on a cold morning, when the mountain mist still clung to the pine boughs like gossamer threads. She rode a sturdy mare with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to difficult terrain. Her practical riding dress and worn leather satchel showed she valued function over fashion. More importantly, she carried a small telegraph key in that satchel, a secret link to the outside world that few in Dry Creek knew existed. The schoolteacher had received Jeremiah's carefully worded message via Murphy O'Brien, and her reply had been immediate and affirmative. She understood the gravity of the situation and possessed resources they desperately needed. As she dismounted and tethered her horse, her intelligent brown eyes took in the cabin's defensive position and the subtle signs that its inhabitants were living under threat. "Captain Cole," she said, with a nod to Jeremiah. Then she turned to Sarah, her expression warm with sincerity. "Mrs. Harwell, I am so sorry for what you've been through. The way those men treated you and your daughter was unconscionable." Katie emerged from the cabin at the sound of voices, her natural curiosity overcoming any shyness. "Are you the teacher?" she asked directly. "I am indeed," Agnes replied, crouching to meet Katie at eye level. "And I hear you've been learning to draw. I would love to see some of your work." As Katie eagerly ran to fetch her sketches, Agnes turned back to the adults. "I have been documenting irregularities in territorial land transfers for months," she explained. "The pattern of forced sales and mysterious accidents has been impossible to ignore. Your situation, Mrs. Harwell, appears to be part of a much larger scheme." Jeremiah wrote swiftly. "How much larger?" Agnes consulted a small notebook from her bag. "At least 15 families across 3 counties, all involving mineral-rich properties, all facing similar methods of debt collection. All of them either sold under duress or lost their land in suspicious circumstances." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Sarah had imagined their troubles were unique, a consequence of Benjamin's poor financial judgment. To discover they were part of a systematic campaign of theft and intimidation was both terrifying and strangely strengthening. At least they were not alone in facing this corruption. "I've been sending reports to the territorial education authorities," Agnes continued, "but my correspondence suggests this banking consortium's influence runs deeper than I initially suspected. Federal intervention may be our only hope for true justice." She drew the telegraph key from her satchel with the pride of someone revealing a powerful weapon. This belonged to my father, who was a territorial surveyor. I have maintained his contacts throughout the federal network of land offices. More importantly, I know people in Washington who specialize in investigating territorial corruption. Jeremiah examined the telegraph key, his expression showing a clear appreciation for its strategic value. In an age when information traveled at the speed of a horse, the ability to communicate instantly across vast distances was a formidable advantage. "Can you contact the federal marshals?" Sarah asked. "Better," Agnes replied. "I can contact investigators from the Department of the Interior who specialize in mineral rights fraud. But we will need concrete proof, not just accusations and suspicion." Sarah and Jeremiah exchanged a look, silently debating how much to reveal about Benjamin's journal. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford to grant carelessly, but Agnes's documentation and federal connections made her their best hope. The decision was made for them when Katie, proudly displaying her drawings for Agnes, inadvertently revealed Benjamin's hidden survey maps. The child had found them while exploring the cabin's storage spaces and, not understanding their significance, had been using them as drawing paper. "Katie, no!" Sarah exclaimed, recognizing the geological notations, but the damage was done. Agnes studied the survey maps with a mounting excitement, her experienced eye immediately recognizing their significance. "These are professional mineral surveys," she said, breathless, "and they show substantial silver deposits throughout this valley." Her husband discovered the deposits, Jeremiah wrote. He refused to sell the mineral rights. He was killed in an accident 2 days later. The implication struck Agnes like a physical blow. "They killed him? For refusing to sell?" "We believe so," Sarah confirmed softly. His journal documents Croft's mounting pressure and a specific threat about him being too stubborn for his own good. Agnes sat down heavily on one of the cabin's chairs, the weight of the revelation settling upon her. "I have been tracking property transfers and suspicious deaths, but I never made the direct connection between a refusal to sell and a subsequent fatal accident. This changes everything." Over the next hour, they hammered out a strategy. Agnes would use her telegraph connections to alert federal investigators while they documented the evidence they'd gathered. Murphy O'Brien would coordinate with other ranchers who might have faced similar pressure. Jeremiah would provide security and tactical planning, his military experience proving invaluable in anticipating their adversaries' likely responses. But their planning session was cut short by a sinister development. Katie, who had been playing outside under Jeremiah's watchful eye, came running back into the cabin, her news chilling them all. "There are bad men coming up the trail," she announced, breathless. "I saw them from the rocks where I like to draw. They have guns, and they look angry." Jeremiah was at the window in an instant, confirming Katie's observation with a grim nod. 6 armed men were approaching the cabin, led by Sheriff Webb. Among them were faces he didn't recognize, hired guns, brought in specifically for this confrontation. Agnes scrambled to gather her telegraph equipment and papers. "They can't know I'm here," she said, her voice a rush of urgency. "My federal contacts are our only hope if something happens to you." Jeremiah was already implementing the defensive procedures he had planned for this exact situation. He ushered Agnes and Katie into the hidden cellar, while Sariah insisted on staying above to face whatever was coming. The approaching confrontation would test everything they had built over the past week: trust, courage, and the fragile hope that justice was still possible in a territory where money seemed to matter more than the law. "Mrs. Harwell," Webb's voice echoed, sharp and clear in the mountain air. "We know you're in there. and we know you're hiding evidence related to territorial crimes. Come out peacefully, and we can discuss terms." But Jeremiah had heard similar offers during a war, where surrender often meant death, regardless of the terms promised. He checked his weapons with practiced efficiency, taking up defensive positions he had hoped he would never need again. Some fights could not be avoided, no matter how much a man valued peace and solitude. The mountain cabin, which had been a refuge, was about to become a battlefield, and all their careful plans would be tested by the violence that felt increasingly inevitable. Outside, 6 armed men waited for a surrender that would never come. Inside, a former soldier prepared to break his long silence in the most permanent way possible. The standoff lasted for 3 tense hours, with Webb's men surrounding the cabin, while Jeremiah maintained defensive positions from within. But the confrontation did not end with gunfire. It ended with a turn none of them had foreseen. Katie was gone. She had vanished during the confusion of a diversionary attack on the cabin's rear entrance. Agnes had pulled the child deeper into the cellar when the shooting began, but the hidden chamber had a second exit, one Benjamin Harwell had dug years before as an emergency escape route. Kate, terrified by the gunshots and wanting to help in some way, had slipped through the narrow tunnel while Agnes was focused on operating her telegraph set to call for federal aid. The child's disappearance was only discovered after the gunmen withdrew at nightfall, apparently satisfied that they had delivered their message of intimidation. When Jeremiah and Sariah searched the cellar and found it empty except for Agnes and her telegraph equipment, the mountain man's controlled composure finally shattered. "Kate!" Sariah's anguished cry echoed across the mountainside as they searched the area around the cabin, but there was no answer. No sign of the child, who had been the very reason for fighting this impossible battle. Agnes emerged from the cellar with more devastating news. Beyond Kate's disappearance, her telegraphic communications had revealed the true scope of the conspiracy they faced. "I've been in contact with investigators from the Department of the Interior," she reported grimly. "The corruption goes all the way up to Territorial Judge Harrison Blackstone himself." She pulled a forged document from her saddlebag, a mining deed showing Blackstone's name as the secret owner of the mineral rights across the entire region. The judge, who was supposed to legally oversee their case, was in fact the mastermind behind the entire land-grabbing scheme. "This isn't just about one banker preying on desperate families," Agnes continued. "Blackstone has been using his judicial authority to legitimize theft on a massive scale. Every family that lost their land, every suspicious death, every forced sale. He's been orchestrating all of it while pretending to represent territorial justice." The revelation struck Sariah like a physical blow. The legal system she had hoped would protect them was the very source of their persecution. Judge Blackstone, who was due to arrive in Dry Creek in a few days to settle their case, was the same man who had ordered Benjamin's murder and was now trying to steal from his daughter. But it was Jeremiah's reaction to Kate's disappearance that marked the most dramatic transformation of all. For the first time in 20 years, words forced their way past the Confederate bullet lodged in his throat, emerging as a near inaudible whisper that gradually gained strength until it became recognizable speech. "Kate," he managed to say. The single word scraped his damaged vocal cords like rusted metal. The effort left him breathless, but something fundamental had shifted within him. The child's peril had broken through the barriers that 2 decades of isolation had built around his heart. "You spoke," Sariah said in wonder, even amidst her terror for her daughter's safety. Jeremiah nodded, touching his throat in astonishment. "The child?" he rasped. "She called me, Daddy Jeremiah, yesterday." I heard her voice when the shooting started, calling for help. The emotional impact of his breakthrough was overshadowed by the urgency of finding Kate, but Sariah understood that something profound had changed in their relationship and in the fight ahead. Jeremiah's voice, damaged but functional, represented hope returning to a man who had all but given up on human connection. Their search through the night revealed Kate's trail leading down the mountain toward Dry Creek, but also signs that she was not traveling alone. Footprints in the soft earth suggested someone had followed her, possibly one of Webb's men who had stayed behind during the retreat. By morning, they had their answer. A message came through one of Agnes's telegraphic contacts. Kate was being held in the abandoned Silver Creek mine, the same place where Benjamin had discovered the silver deposits that had cost him his life. The irony was deliberate and cruel. The child was trapped in the very place where this entire conspiracy had begun. The message came with terms that revealed the full extent of Blackstone's ambitions. In exchange for Kate's safe return, Sariah would sign over not only her original property, but also the mineral rights to all adjacent properties the banking consortium had identified as potentially valuable. The document would legitimize all past forced sales and provide legal cover for future acquisitions throughout the territory. They're not just robbing us, Agnes realized as she studied the proposed agreement. They're using Kate as leverage to legitimize their entire criminal enterprise. Once Sariah signs this document, every family they've stolen from will have no legal recourse. Jeremiah's shaken voice grew stronger as rage fueled his determination. We're not signing anything, he declared, each word still an effort but clearly audible. We're going to get Katie back, and we're going to expose this conspiracy, no matter the cost. The plan that emerged from their desperate counsel combined Jeremiah's military expertise with Agnes's knowledge of the local terrain and the promised support of Murphy O'Brien and other ranching families who had been victims of the conspiracy. But it also required them to gamble everything on a direct assault against an enemy who held all the apparent advantages. Murphy arrived at the cabin before noon with two other war veterans, men who had served under Jeremiah during the conflict and still trusted his tactical judgment despite his years of isolation. Their presence completed the circle of reunion, transforming the silent hermit back into Captain Cole, the officer who had never lost a battle during 4 years of desperate fighting. The mine is heavily guarded, Murphy reported. At least 8 men, including some professionals I don't recognize. But the terrain gives us advantages if we're willing to take risks. Jeremiah studied the hand-drawn maps Murphy had prepared, his strategic mind engaging fully for the first time since the war's end. We go in after dark, he decided, his voice growing steadier with each planning session. 3 diversionary attacks to draw their attention, while the real assault comes through the old mine tunnels. Sariah insisted on participating, her desperation to reach Katie overriding any concern for her own safety. She's my daughter, she declared when the men tried to dissuade her. I will not wait in safety while others risk their lives for my child. Agnes would coordinate communications with the federal authorities, who were finally beginning to act on her carefully documented evidence. If they could rescue Katie and survive the assault, they would have the testimony and documentation needed to bring down the entire conspiracy. But as they prepared for what could be their final battle, each of them understood they were fighting for more than one child's freedom. They were challenging a system of corruption that threatened every honest family in the territory, confronting an evil that had taken root in the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. The abandoned Silver Creek mine had been the source of Benjamin Harwell's discovery and the cause of his death. Now, It would be the place where the fate of his family and the future of justice in the territory would finally be decided. Jeremiah Cole had found his voice again, but whether that voice would get the chance to speak for the innocent remained to be seen. The war that had taken his speech 2 decades ago was about to begin again, this time not between North and South, but between those who would sacrifice anything for profit, and those who still believed some things were worth more than money. The Confederate sniper rifle emerged from its hiding place like an artifact from another life, wrapped in oiled canvas and preserved with the same meticulous care Jeremiah applied to everything in his mountain sanctuary. He unwrapped the weapon slowly. His scarred hands traced the familiar contours of the walnut stock and steel barrel, with the reverence of a man greeting an old friend he had hoped never to need again. The rifle was a Whitworth .451 caliber, captured from Confederate forces at Gettysburg and modified by Union armorers to suit Jeremiah's specific skills. Its hexagonal barrel and precision-machined components made it deadly accurate at distances that would challenge modern marksmen, let alone those of the Civil War era. In Jeremiah's hands, it had been responsible for eliminating Confederate officers at ranges that seemed impossible to those who witnessed his marksmanship. "I haven't touched this weapon in 20 years, he said quietly, his voice growing stronger with each passing hour as his damaged vocal cords remembered their function. "I swore I'd never kill again after Appomattox." Sariah watched him clean and inspect the rifle with practiced efficiency, recognizing the transformation happening before her eyes. The gentle mountain hermit who had taught Katie to draw was receding, replaced by something harder and more dangerous. A professional soldier preparing for the kind of work that had made him a legend among his fellow veterans. "Sometimes we don't get to choose," she replied softly. "Sometimes evil forces our hand." Murphy O'Brien and his 2 companions, Frank Morrison and Dutch Vanderberg, arrived with their own weapons and a grim determination. These men had served under Captain Cole during some of the war's bloodiest campaigns, and their loyalty had survived 2 decades of civilian life. They understood what they were asking of their former commander, and what it might cost him to become that man again. "The mine is in a natural basin surrounded by rocky ridges," Murphy reported, spreading hand-drawn maps on Jeremiah's table. 8 guards we can see, probably more inside the tunnels with the girl. They have a clear line of sight to the main entrance, but the old mining equipment provides cover if we're careful." Frank Morrison, a lean man with prematurely gray hair and steady hands, studied the tactical situation with professional interest. "How do you want to play this, Captain? Direct assault or something more subtle?" Jeremiah considered the options as he continued to prepare his weapons. The rifle's scope had been crafted by German opticians and remained remarkably clear despite its age. At 600 yards, he could put a bullet through a playing card, assuming his skills hadn't eroded during his years of isolation. "We'll probe the terrain," he decided. "Dutch, you take the North Ridge with your Spencer rifle. Frank, you'll approach from the east, using the old ore cart tracks as cover. Murphy and I will go in through the main tunnel system that connects to the abandoned shafts." "And me?" Sariah asked firmly. The men exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the inclusion of a civilian woman in their assault plans. But Jeremiah understood something they did not. This wasn't just about military tactics. It was about a mother fighting for her child. And that kind of desperation could be more effective than years of training. "You'll stay with me in the tunnels," he said, after a long pause. "Katie's going to need to see your face when we find her. And if something happens to me, you'll be the one to get her out." Agnes Payne had established her telegraph station on a hidden overlook with a view of the mine where she could coordinate with federal authorities while documenting everything that transpired during the rescue attempt. Her messages to Washington had finally prompted action. Federal marshals were on their way, but they wouldn't arrive for at least 2 days. Sariah couldn't wait that long. As night drew near, each member of the rescue party made their own personal preparations for what could be their final mission. Frank Morrison cleaned his service revolver with the same care Jeremiah showed his rifle, while Dutch Vanderberg honed the combat knife that had served him through 3 years of close-quarters fighting. Murphy O'Brien wrote a letter to his wife, just in case he didn't return, to tell her himself how the mission ended. Sariah's preparations were both practical and emotional. She tucked her hair beneath a man's hat and donned dark clothes, fit for moving through the mine tunnels. But she also spent long minutes clutching Benjamin's journal, drawing strength from his words, and promising his memory that Katie would return home safely. "He would have done the same thing," she said, when Jeremiah found her reading by the lamplight. "Benjamin would have fought anyone who threatened our daughter, regardless of the odds." "He was a good man," Jeremiah replied, his voice now clear enough to convey genuine emotion. "Katie has the best of both her parents. That strength will help her survive whatever they put her through." The conversation unearthed something they had both been avoiding, a burgeoning connection between them. One that went beyond their shared determination to protect Katie. In the span of a week, they had become something akin to a family, forged in crisis but sustained by genuine affection and respect. "When this is over," Sariah said carefully, "what happens then?" Jeremiah considered the question as he checked the action of his rifle one last time. "When this is over, we'll have choices we don't have now. Good choices, I hope." The promise implicit in his words gave Sariah courage for the dangers ahead. Whatever happened in the mine, she would not face the future alone. The silent man of the mountain had found his voice again, and part of what he chose to say was that he cared for her and Katie's well-being, beyond this immediate crisis. As complete darkness settled over the mountains, the rescue team moved into position with military precision. Dutch Vanderberg took his post on Northridge, invisible among the rocks but with a clear view of the main mine entrances. Frank Morrison worked his way through the abandoned ore cart system, using rusted machinery and broken timbers for cover. Approaching from the east, Murphy, O'Brien, and Jeremiah entered the old tunnel system through a hidden entrance Benjamin Harwell had discovered during his geological surveys. The tunnels were dark, tight, and treacherous, filled with unstable timbers and pockets of bad air that could kill as efficiently as any bullet. But they also provided the only route to Katie that didn't involve a frontal assault against impossible odds. Sariah followed close behind Jeremiah, trying to control her breathing as they navigated passages barely wide enough for a single person. The mountain pressed in on them like a living thing, and she found herself fighting claustrophobia as well as the fear for her daughter's safety. They moved in total silence, communicating through hand signals Jeremiah had taught her during their brief planning session. The mine's acoustics meant any sound could carry for hundreds of yards through the interconnected tunnel system, alerting their enemies long before they reached Katie's location. After what felt like hours, but was likely less than 30 minutes, they heard voices echoing from deep within the mine. Katie's voice, faint and frightened, but unmistakably alive, crying out questions that were met with harsh replies from her captors. The sound of his adopted daughter's distress awakened something primal in Jeremiah, a protective fury that had been building since she disappeared. "Steady, easy, Captain," Murphy whispered, recognizing the signs of a man preparing to abandon caution for direct action. "We stick to the plan." But plans had a way of changing when children's lives were at stake, and Jeremiah was already calculating how many men he could eliminate before they realized they were under attack. The rifle on his back felt familiar and comforting, like a part of himself he had forgotten was missing. Agnes Pine's telegraph key chattered softly as she maintained contact with federal authorities, documenting everything for the official investigation that would follow. Miles away, Dutch Vanderberg settled into his sniper's perch and began the patient work of identifying targets through the scope of his rifle. The battle for Katie's freedom was about to begin. Everyone involved understood that failure meant more than the death of one child. It meant the triumph of a system that valued profit over justice and treated innocent families as obstacles to be removed. This was a war between good and evil, reignited in the depths of a silver mine, fought by men who had already given their youth to similar battles, and by a woman who had already lost too much to consider retreat. Captain Jeremiah Cole was about to find out if 20 years of silence had dulled his edge, or if some skills, once mastered, never truly leave a man's soul. The first shot came from Dutch Vanderberg's position on the North Ridge. The sharp crack of the Spencer repeater echoed through the mountain valley like a clap of thunder. Through his scope, he had identified 2 sentries posted near the main mine entrance, and his bullet found its mark with the precision that had made him invaluable during the war's most desperate fighting. The second guard dove for cover behind mining equipment, shouting warnings that brought armed men scrambling from the depths of the mine complex. But Dutch was already working the Spencer's lever, chambering a new round, and tracking his next target with the patience of a hunter who knew that haste meant death. Frank Morrison heard the shots and began his own assault from the east. Using the abandoned ore cart system for cover, he advanced through rusted machinery and broken timber, his Navy Colt barking twice in rapid succession, dropping a guard who was trying to flank Dutch's position while pinning down 2 others behind an overturned ore cart. In the tunnels below, Jeremiah and Sariah heard the gunfire and knew their carefully coordinated attack had begun. Katie's voice grew louder and more frightened as her captors reacted to the assault above, but at least they knew she was still alive and relatively close to their current position. "Stay behind me," Jeremiah whispered to Sariah, his damaged voice carrying clearly in the confined space despite its rasp. "When we find her, you grab Katie and go back the way we came. Don't wait for me." Sariah nodded, though she had no intention of abandoning him if the situation grew desperate. They had come too far together to let fear separate them now, regardless of what military protocol might dictate about protecting civilians. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber where mining equipment had been abandoned decades earlier, creating a labyrinth of shadows and hiding places. Lamplight flickered from deeper within the complex, accompanied by harsh voices arguing over how to respond to the attack. Woven between those voices, Katie's frightened questions cut through the darkness like accusations against her captor's cruelty. Jeremiah moved through the chamber with the fluid grace of a predator. His rifle was ready, but held low to prevent an accidental discharge in the confined space. Every sound, every shadow, every shift in the air current registered in his consciousness as he navigated terrain that could conceal enemy or ally with equal efficiency. A guard emerged from a side passage, his carbine raised and ready to fire at anything that moved. Jeremiah's response was instant and silent, a knife throw that dropped the man before he could cry out a warning. 20 years of mountain living had kept his reflexes sharp, even if he had shunned using them for violence. "Mother!" Katie's voice suddenly sounded much closer than before. "Mother, are you coming?" "Katie," Sariah answered before Jeremiah could stop her, maternal instinct overpowering tactical caution. "We're here, darling. We're coming." The exchange gave away their position to any enemy within earshot, but it also pinpointed Katie's location in the complex tunnel system. She was being held in what had been the mine's main processing chamber, likely 50 yards deeper into the mountain, through passages that offered multiple opportunities for an ambush. Above them, the gunfight continued with rising intensity. Dutch Vanderberg had taken out 3 guards and pinned down 2 more, but reinforcements were now arriving from the surrounding hills. Men on horseback, who had been staged as backup in case the mine's security was challenged. His position on the north ridge was becoming untenable as concentrated rifle fire zeroed in on his location. Frank Morrison had fought his way to within 30 yards of the main mine entrance, but found himself trapped behind mining equipment as crossfire from multiple directions made it impossible to advance. His ammunition was running low, and the guards were positioning themselves to cut off any attempt at retreat. Murphy O'Brien reached Jeremiah and Sariah just as the situation above ground began to deteriorate. His face was grim with news that changed everything about their tactical situation. "More men on the way," he reported tersely. "At least a dozen riders coming up from the south. We've got maybe 10 minutes before this becomes a siege instead of a rescue." The implication was clear. They had to get to Katie and extract her before the reinforcements arrived, or they risked being trapped in the mine with no hope of escape. The careful timing of their attack was unraveling, as their enemies were better prepared than anyone had anticipated. "Where is she?" Jeremiah asked. "Main chamber. Maybe 50 yards that way." Murphy pointed deeper into the tunnel system. "But there are at least 4 men with her, and they know we're coming." A torn scrap from Katie's dress appeared in the beam of Jeremiah's lantern, a strip of blue fabric snagged on a wooden support beam. The child had managed to leave a beacon even in captivity, showing a courage and cleverness that made her adoptive father proud, even in the midst of mortal danger. "She's been leaving a trail," Sariah whispered, recognizing her daughter's resourcefulness. "My brave girl." And the gunfire above intensified as Dutch Vanderberg was forced to abandon his position under a hail of concentrated rifle fire. Frank Morrison's ammunition ran out completely, forcing him to rely on his knife and whatever weapons he could scavenge from fallen enemies. Time was running out, and the rescue of Katie Harwell had become a race against impossible odds. The main processing chamber opened before them, like a cathedral of shadow and lamplight, its high ceiling supported by massive timber beams that had somehow survived decades of neglect. In the center of the space, Katie sat on a wooden crate with her hands bound, surrounded by 4 armed men who had positioned themselves to control all approaches to their prisoner. Benjamin's old mining tools were scattered around the chamber, picks, shovels, and drilling equipment that spoke of the honest labor that had uncovered the silver deposits now causing so much bloodshed. The irony was not lost on Jeremiah, who realized they would need those same tools to complete Katie's rescue. "That's far enough," shouted the leader of Katie's guards, a lean man with cold eyes and a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to violence. "Drop your weapons and step into the light where we can see you." Jeremiah stepped out from the tunnel mouth, his hands partially raised, the rifle held loosely but ready for immediate use. Behind him, Sariah fought every maternal instinct that screamed for her to run to her daughter, regardless of the consequences. "Katie, are you hurt?" Sariah cried out. "I'm okay, Mama," Katie answered, a tremor in her voice that suggested she was trying to be braver than she felt. "They said you would come for me." "We're here now, sweetheart," Jeremiah said, his voice echoing through the chamber with surprising force. "Everything is going to be all right." The lead guard smiled coldly. "Captain Cole, I presume. Your reputation in the war precedes you. But this isn't Gettysburg, and you're outnumbered 4-1. 5-1, another voice corrected from the shadows. Sheriff Webb stepped into the lamplight, his gun drawn and aimed directly at Sariah. "Mrs. Harwell has caused us considerable inconvenience. Judge Blackstone is very displeased." The mention of Blackstone's name confirmed what they had suspected. The territorial judge was not just complicit in the conspiracy, but actively directing operations from behind his facade of legal authority. The corruption ran deeper than any of them had imagined. "Where's Blackstone?" Jeremiah asked, buying time as he assessed his tactical options. "Close enough," Webb replied. "He'll be arriving shortly to personally oversee the resolution of this unfortunate situation." Above them, the sound of gunfire ceased abruptly, meaning either Dutch Vanderberg and Frank Morrison had been killed or captured, or the reinforcements had arrived in sufficient numbers to end the external battle. Either way, their window of opportunity was closing fast. Murphy O'Brien appeared in the tunnel entrance behind Jeremiah, his grim expression confirming their worst fears. "Dutch is down," he reported quietly. "Frank's position was overrun. We're on our own." The tactical situation had deteriorated beyond any hope of a conventional rescue. 5 armed men held Katie hostage in a chamber with limited cover and no alternate escape routes. The tunnel system that had brought them here could easily become a trap if their enemies controlled the exits. But Jeremiah had faced worse during the war. He knew desperation could be a more potent weapon than any rifle. He studied the chamber's layout with the eyes of a man who had turned hopeless situations into victories through sheer audacity and precise timing. "The child doesn't need to be part of this," he said to Webb. "Let her go and we can settle our differences like men." "I'm afraid that's not possible," Webb replied. "Judge Blackstone has specific plans for the Harwell girl. She represents a valuable guarantee to ensure her mother's cooperation with our legal proceedings." The casual mention of using a child as a bargaining chip stirred something primal in Jeremiah's protective instincts. The Confederate bullet in his throat seemed to pulse with a phantom ache, but his voice came out clear and strong when he spoke again. "Then we have nothing more to discuss." His movement was so sudden that Webb barely had time to register the threat before the pickaxe Jeremiah had thrown struck him in the chest. The impact of the heavy tool slammed him back against the stone wall. Sariah dove for Katie as gunshots erupted throughout the chamber, rolling behind Benjamin's old cart for cover. Murphy O'Brien's rifle cracked twice in quick succession, felling 2 guards before return fire forced him back into the tunnel entrance. The remaining guards scrambled for better positions among the mining equipment, their crossfire making any rescue attempt seem impossible. Proving herself her father's daughter, Katie rolled off the crate and crawled toward her mother, despite her bound hands. Showing the same grit that had carried Benjamin through years of frontier hardship, she reached the shelter of the cart, just as Jeremiah's rifle took out the lead guard with a shot that proved his legendary marksmanship remained untouched by 2 decades of disuse. "Can you get us out of here?" Sariah asked desperately, as bullets ricocheted off the metal cart above their heads. Jeremiah offered a grim smile as he reloaded his rifle. "I've spent most of my adult life getting people out of impossible situations. This is just another day's work." But even as he spoke those confident words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the mine tunnels. Judge Blackstone was arriving, with enough reinforcements to ensure that this impossible situation might finally be insurmountable, even for the legendary tactical skills of Captain Cole. 6 months later, the silver mine that had been the source of so much tragedy had become the bedrock of the Harwell family's prosperity. Federal investigators had confirmed Benjamin's geological surveys with stunning accuracy. The silver deposits ran throughout the mountain valley in veins so rich they promised decades of profitable extraction. The new land deed, properly registered in Sariah's name under federal oversight, represented not just legal ownership, but the security she had fought so desperately to protect. The main office of the mine now stood where the old processing chamber had witnessed the final confrontation with Judge Blackstone's corruption. That battle had ended when Agnes Pine's federal contacts arrived with a full company of territorial marshals, just as Jeremiah was preparing for what could have been his last stand. Blackstone himself was arrested while trying to flee the territory, his carefully constructed empire of legal theft crumbling as evidence of his crimes spread through the territorial capital. Jeremiah Cole stood in the office doorway, watching Sariah review mining reports with the same careful attention Benjamin used to give his geological surveys. His voice grew stronger with each passing month, though he still chose his words with care, a man who had learned to value speech precisely because he had lived so long without it. "The Eastern Tunnel is producing better than expected," Sariah reported, looking up from her papers with the satisfied expression of a woman who had found her calling in business management. "If these numbers hold, we'll be able to provide jobs for half the territory within 2 years." The mine's success was transforming Dry Creek from a struggling frontier town into a thriving community where honest work earned an honest wage. Many of the families who had been driven from their land by Blackstone's conspiracy had returned to find opportunities in the expanding mining operation or the businesses that supported it. Agnes Pine had accepted the position of territorial supervisor for education, using her federal connections to establish proper schools throughout the region. Her telegraph equipment, once hidden for clandestine communication with investigators in Washington, now served as the official territorial communication hub, a symbol of how tools used to fight corruption could become instruments of legitimate progress. "Katie wants to show you something," Jeremiah said, his voice filled with the warmth that had developed during their gradual transformation from desperate allies into something like a family. The child in question came running from the mine entrance in a clean, well-fitted blue dress, a far cry from the torn ribbons she had left as trail markers during her captivity. At 9 years old, she had grown taller and more confident, though she still carried the cornhusk doll her father had made during the last winter months before his death. "Papa Jeremiah, look what I found," she announced, holding up a piece of silver ore that glittered in the afternoon sun. "Mr. O'Brien says it might be the richest sample yet." Murphy O'Brien emerged from the mine shaft behind her, his weathered face lit with the satisfaction of a man who had found meaningful work in his retirement. As mine foreman, he oversaw operations with the same attention to detail that had made him invaluable during his military service. "The kid has an eye for quality ore," Murphy confirmed, his pride evident. "Found this piece in a side tunnel most grown men would have walked right past." Katie beamed at the praise, then turned to Sariah with the serious expression she used for important announcements. "Mama, when I grow up, I want to be a geologist like Papa Benjamin. I want to find the hidden treasures in the mountains." Sariah smiled at her daughter's ambition, remembering Benjamin's own fascination with the secrets hidden beneath Wyoming's rugged landscape. "Then we'll make sure you have the education to chase that dream, sweetheart." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar buggy carrying Doc Whitfield and an official-looking passenger. The elderly storekeeper had been appointed as the territorial representative for federal mining oversight, his reputation for honesty making him invaluable to the investigators, still untangling the web of corruption Blackstone had woven. "Mrs. Harwell," Doc Whitfield called out as he stepped down, "I'd like you to meet Marshal Harrison, no relation to our former judge." The federal marshal was a serious man in his 40s, whose deliberate manner suggested the kind of thoroughness that had made the case against Blackstone's conspiracy so successful. "Ma'am, I wanted to deliver the final documentation regarding your mineral rights in person. The federal government has officially recognized your ownership of all deposits within the designated territory." He handed Sariah a leather-bound folder containing the new land deed, the legal document that represented everything she and Benjamin had dreamed of when they first staked their claim. This deed, however, was backed by federal authority that no territorial judge could ever challenge or corrupt. "There is one more thing," Marshal Harrison continued. "The Department of the Interior has asked me to extend an offer to Mr. Cole to serve as a territorial security advisor, given his proven expertise in handling organized criminal activity." Jeremiah considered the offer as he watched Katie examine her silver ore sample with the intense focus she'd inherited from both her parents. The idea of returning to public service was appealing, but his priorities had shifted during the months of family life that followed his exile in the mountains. "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, "but I have responsibilities here that are more important than any government post." That evening, as the sun painted the Wyoming mountains in familiar shades of gold and amber, the three of them sat on the porch of their new home, built on the spot where Sariah's original cabin had stood before Blackstone's men burned it to the ground. Katie worked on her drawings while the adults discussed plans for expanding the mine operations and the school system that would serve the growing community. "Sometimes I think about how different things could have been," Sariah said softly, "if Benjamin had lived to see what we've built here." "He saw it," Jeremiah replied, his voice filled with the certainty of a man who had learned to believe in purposes larger than individual ambition. "Every choice he made, every risk he took, was to give you and Katie this very future." Katie looked up from her drawing, a detailed sketch of the mountain peak that dominated the valley, rendered with a skill that would have made her father proud. "I think Papa Benjamin would like Papa Jeremiah," she announced, with the simple wisdom that children sometimes possess. "I think so too," Sariah agreed, taking Jeremiah's hand as they watched their daughter return to her art. The new land deed lay on the table between them, but it was the sound of Katie's laughter echoing through the valley that truly marked their victory over the forces that had tried to tear their family apart. Some silences, Jeremiah reflected, had to be broken for love to find its voice. And some voices, once found, were worth preserving for all the generations to come.